Well, welcome and thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to kick off the quarter for the Track Friday seminar, and I am very especially excited because, as Mike mentioned, I work for the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and for many years we've done a bicycle lunch and learn, and we are now coordinating or collaborating rather with Trek to do a active transportation lunch and learn, which will be part of the Track Friday seminar. So this is the first session that we're doing that. Before we get started, we have some housekeeping notes.
How do we get
we'll be recording today's seminar, and we'll make it available along with the presentation slides on the Trek website. That's trek.pdx.edu. And so a little bit about the partners. The City of Portland Bureau of Transportation is a community partner in shaping a livable city. We build, plan, manage, and maintain an effective and safe transportation system that provides people and businesses access and mobility. We keep Portland moving. And TREC, or the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, produces research and tools and for transportation decision makers, develops K-12 curriculum to expand the diversity and capacity of the workforce, and engages students and young professionals through education. Just a word, our next joint session of the Trek Friday seminar, PBOT edition, is on March 15th, where our PBOT pedestrian coordinator, Michelle Marks, and transportation planner, Francesca Petricolo, will present on PED-PDX, addressing equity through citywide pedestrian planning. And if you're interested in pedestrians or in doing planning with an equitable lens, please attend or sign up to watch it online. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our online audience. You'll receive the video recording and presentation slides in email following the seminar. During the presentation, you can submit questions by using the questions pane on your control panel. We'll keep track of the questions and we'll respond to them at the end of the session. If we run out of time, we'll send out written responses to those questions that we weren't able to answer. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters. Brianna Orr is Portland Bureau of Transportation's e-scooter pilot project manager and our bike share coordinator. John MacArthur is the Sustainable Transportation Program Manager at TREC at PSU. And Dr. Jennifer Dill is the Director of TREC and the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, as well as a professor of urban studies and planning here at PSU. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks for coming. We have a couple seats right here, and there's one right here. So people, if you want to grab a seat. So I'll first ask, who has tried a scooter in Portland or somewhere else? Wow, everybody's tried it. Who would say that they're a power user? Two power, but a lot of people have tried it. So this webinar and seminar is really going to kind of focus on our pilot project that the city ran this summer and fall. And I think it's a really great that what the city has done and really is probably the first comprehensive look at how scooters were used in a city and evaluating how they were used and the issues and benefits and impacts of scooters. So Brianna Orr is with PBOT, and she will be talking about the study that they put together and the report. And then Jennifer Dill is going to come on and go a little deeper into some of the survey work and analysis that the city had. So we got some data and we're able to do a little bit deeper dive. So that said, in general, this is a new topic, shared micromobility. We all have heard of shared mobility and the ideas of Uber and Lyft and moving people around. This is bringing it down to the micromobility scale. And so here's kind of a definition. We're talking about low speed devices. We think of scooters, but it's also bicycles. But what could be next? Shared hoverboards, shared other devices, maybe seated scooters. But this is a evolving, emerging, and maybe disruptive marketplace. These typically are, point to point, and you can, access it through an app, and that you kind of charge per minute. That said, what are the, and I said potential benefits because we don't really know what those are, and Brianna's gonna kind of dive deeper into were these benefits or not. But they're there to potentially expand mobility options, transit connections. Can they help people first mile, last mile? Do they lower environmental impacts because they're getting people out of cars? Is there reduction of congestion and parking? They have a lot of opportunities, even workforce opportunities. And then ultimately, they provide maybe some fun and freedom, and that will get people to access these new mobility options. But there are also some potential issues, right? So there's safety concerns. This is obviously something that a lot of people have brought up. There's impact on other modes. Do they take away? Do they complement? What do they do to other riderships, and what modes are they taking away from? There's weight and equity concerns and environmental concerns. So all this, what we're hoping that we can dive in both on this report, but in future research that we hope to do. That said, last year was the year of the scooter. Maybe 2 years ago was the year of the hoverboard, but this year is the year of the scooter. Lots of press, right? There was either going to save, and change and transform our way of moving around, or was it going to invade us? And were there issues around safety? So a lot of interest, but not a lot of research and data for us to say, what is it doing to our communities and cities? That said, right now there's roughly 11 scooter companies that are in the US operating to say, and roughly about 70 cities have operational kind of programs, which represent about 166 separate operations going on here. Many cities have multiple of these companies working at once. And so that said, like Austin, in October, they had 340,000 trips. They basically have 15,000 permitted scooters, in the city, and that's a lot of trips in one month. So they have a huge opportunity to transform how we are moving around and thinking about moving around. So I'm going to transfer to Brianna right now, because not on there. This is an active map. Portland's not active, so they're not up there on the map. So we will find out from Brianna what's coming next. So I'll transfer, let her take over now.
And spending part of your Friday with us, and thanks for listening that are online. When we started looking at e-scooters, the first company launched in 2017 in Santa Monica, and city had this moment of a little bit of curiosity of what is this new vehicle, how do people use it, as well as what should we do about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our a little bit of context and kind of how we approached this new vehicle, where we got data, and some of the pilot findings that we have, as well as the next steps. So again, when we started hearing about the e-scooters popping up in cities across the country, we took a look at, what are our overall goals? So this is one where we're looking to move people, instead of in single occupancy cars, by other modes. So this is a long-term goal that City of Portland has. And so on the left, where you see our daily trip, daily trips, and if we continue on the trajectory that we have now, where about 60% of folks are getting around by themselves in a vehicle, we're going to have over 2 million trips happening in the city. So that's going to be a problem for us because we're not building any new roads, we're not expanding new roads. We have to use the space that we have, and so we need to really use that space more efficiently. So what we're trying to do over that long period of time is really get that vehicle miles traveled down, get those vehicle trips down, and that's what part of our work at PBOT. So I think John did a really good job kind of explaining this context and how do they work. So it's, e-scooters are opened with an app. They're for point-to-point trips, and they operate and rent out of the right-of-way, so from a sidewalk, and in some cities from a street. So that's kind of the trigger for the city to get involved if a vendor is operating in the right-of-way and using that space to do transactions. And so really when we were looking at this pilot, again, we wanted to look at what are some of applicable City of Portland goals that we have already. I think it's really easy for cities to, when thinking about something new, have moments of panic and not really sure, what should be the North Star. In Portland, we have our transportation system plan. We have these set goals. So anytime that a new micromobility solution comes up, I think we're going to redirect to what are we trying to do here? Does this fit within where we're trying to go? So again, reducing private motor vehicle use and congestion. We also want to prevent injuries and fatalities on our streets. So that's our overall Vision Zero goals. We want to expand opportunities for underserved communities. And we also want to reduce air pollution, including climate pollution. So those are the 4 metrics that we evaluated e-scooters under. And we'll talk a little bit about where we got our data. So knowing what we wanted to understand, we asked companies to provide trip data, so where trips are ending and starting, as well as what are the routes that people are using in between those points, as well as where are scooters first available, or where are they available anytime in the city. Are companies only deploying them downtown? We set up a requirement where companies had to deploy at least 100 scooters to East Portland, so one of our historically underserved neighborhoods. And we also asked for collision and complaint data that is reported to those companies, so that's self-reported. We also conducted a user survey, which asked, participants and users of the system, what they would have done otherwise if they hadn't used an e-scooter, and we'll go into that, as well as a whole host of other questions. We also worked with Multnomah County Health Department to understand injuries and injury rates for e-scooters. Again, looking at that Vision Zero goal, does this help us meet some of those targets? We also did a public opinion poll from DHM Research, so asking not just users, but the entire population, what do you think about e-scooters? How did the pilot go for you, and things like that. We also hosted 3 separate focus groups to really kind of dive deep into groups that we may not have heard from online. So we wanted to be sure that we heard from Black Portlanders, East Portlanders, and people with disabilities. So we held 3 separate focus groups for those folks. And then we also, as the city, received reports of injuries or complaints, as well as overall community feedback. So just some really quick pilot facts and overview. We ran a 4-month pilot, 120 days. Companies could operate anywhere within the city limits. And we permitted companies to have a total of 2,000 scooters. On those scooters, we had 700,000 trips and about 800,000 miles ridden. And average trips per day was about 5,000, almost 6,000 trips per day. And then one thing interesting to note, and when we get this data, we can really start to slice and dice it. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. But average trip length in downtown is a lot shorter than the average trip length that we saw in East Portland. I think it makes a lot of sense given that how many destinations there are downtown, and we have a more tightly gridded network. But those are some of the questions that we can start to ask of this new transportation option. So what do we find out? One of our big questions was, what are people going to use these things for? And turns out they use them to get to a destination. So 71% of folks said through our user survey that they use e-scooters to get to somewhere that they're trying to go. It's not just for fun or recreation. This was supported through what we saw in our daily trips. So the left is the trip start time, and you can see that the orange band really highlights where the peak travel times were. And so we see that evening peak travel time is most popular, as well as weekend evening peak as well. And just to note, this matches really closely with what we see with our Biketown system. another big question and one of our goals, does this help reduce driving and ride sharing? And yes, it does. So Portlanders said 34% of Portlanders surveyed said that they would have taken their own personal car, or they would have taken an Uber, Lyft, taxi if the scooter hadn't been available. And just to note, that number is a lot higher for folks that don't live in Portland. So 48% of people visiting Portland said that they would have done those same things. We also learned that e-scooters attracted new people to active transportation. So this is a question, are we just going to be shifting people away from biking to e-scooters? What is this going to do to Bike Town, and things like that? What we found was that 3/4 of folks said that they don't regularly use Bike Town, and about 1/3 of folks said that they don't use their own personal bike for transportation. So really, again, kind of bringing new people to the bike lane, as we started calling it, or, and really expanding what the bike lane is for more people and more types of vehicles. Through that public opinion poll, we asked folks and Portlanders how they felt after the pilot ended, and 62% of Portlanders said they felt positively about the e-scooter pilot, and we really think that's a good majority of folks saying yes, this is a good thing for Portland, and that was a big question that we had. So given who's in the room and probably online, and I wanted to dive in a little bit to some of the what we found with trip distribution and where people use these things. So this is in our report as well, and the dots on the map represent trips that went through, scooters that traveled through that dot, essentially. So the lowest that we have marked here is at least 250 trips traveled through one of these dots. The highest is over 1,000. So you can really see that trips were spread out throughout the city, certainly concentrated in inner city and downtown, but really a lot in Northeast Portland, as well as in East Portland. And when we zoom in a little bit, and this is not spatial analysis at all, but just looking at the map, what we started to see was just our bike network really start to pop in this. So the north-south route that you see there is Vancouver and Williams, and the east-west connection is northeast going. And this is what we heard too through our user survey, is that people prefer, when they're using e-scooters, they prefer to ride where there's bike facilities, or low-speed streets like our neighborhood greenways. And then thanks to having this data, we also could understand what happened in East Portland. We had that requirement for companies to place at least 100 scooters there. Did anybody ride them? And yes, they did. So we had over 44,000 trips that happened in East Portland. So that orange line is the line on the map that we drew, which follows what we call our pattern area, which is just planning lingo, but yes, we had 44,000 trips within that area. And again, you can kind of see the bike network as well. So Division, 122nd were popular areas. So that was all great stuff. And we also found out some of the potential issues that John mentioned. So sidewalk riding definitely reduced pedestrian comfort. And we heard from a lot of folks throughout the pilot period that they just didn't feel safe with scooters who can go 15 miles an hour on the sidewalk. In the state of Oregon, e-scooters aren't legally allowed to ride on sidewalks. And so this is one of the areas that Portland Bureau of Transportation needs to look at and see how we can reduce that. We also found out from those focus groups, and we heard from people with disabilities, that especially parked vehicles creates some accessibility issues for them. So anything that's parked correctly that might be blocking a bus transit stop, or partially in the sidewalk, and in areas where we don't have sidewalks. I think it's particularly tricky for any user to really understand where they should be leaving the e-scooter after they're done with it. Another thing that we found is that companies didn't perform as well as we would have liked on our equity goals. So even though we had vehicles and we had trips in East Portland, companies overall didn't. We had one company that met our requirements for deployment in East Portland, and the other two didn't. We also didn't see as much uptake on our low-income plans as we would have liked to see. So we had only 50 participants signed up for a low-income plan throughout the 3 companies, so pretty low. And we also heard from folks through our focus groups with Black Portlanders and East Portlanders that they inherently have some barriers to using this, including needing a cell phone, needing credit cards, just being reluctant to link their credit card to this private company, as well as just having a fear of being racially profiled and being harassed. And so I think that just kind of speaks to a broader issue of folks' discomfort with putting themselves in the right of way and that personal fear and personal safety. So on the injuries, as I mentioned, we work with Multnomah County Health Department to understand what happened during the pilot period. So e-scooter related injuries were 5% of our total traffic related injuries during this period. So relatively low. And what we saw was that the majority of those collisions happened because someone fell while they were riding solo. So they didn't have a collision with anybody necessarily, but maybe they hit a pothole, or maybe they, it was their first time and weren't sure how to use it, or maybe it was slick and they went over a grate or something like that. But I think what that speaks to is that we know that folks were going under 15 miles an hour. And we also saw with the Multnomah County Health Department's analysis that a majority of folks did not need to take an ambulance to get to the ER or urgent care, which is where these numbers come from. So that also speaks to kind of a low severity overall. And we did see, a few injuries that happen either with scooter riders crashing into someone walking and that person walking getting injured and going to the hospital, or that scooter rider going to the hospital themselves after that collision. And so we also asked folks to submit any issues that they experienced during the pilot. So we had an online form available for anybody to fill out. And this is kind of the breakdown of what we heard from folks. So again, majority of those complaints talking about issues with sidewalk riding. And also a large majority of people complaining about other folks not wearing helmets. So a helmet is required for e-scooters in the state of Oregon, and that was a large part of the public's concern. So what we were a little bit surprised by was just the parking issues. Actually, the complaints around parking were pretty low. But again, when we really spoke and talked with people with disabilities, that was the highest concern for them. And so that kind of raises the level of concern for us as the transportation department, making sure that our sidewalks are accessible and safe for everybody. So again, I went through those really fast because I know that our report's out. You may have seen it already and read through it, but going back to what we were trying to do, we really wanted to understand if e-scooters can fit into some of these goals. And I think, they've shown that they have a lot of potential to, especially with reducing vehicle miles traveled and congestion on our streets. I think they showed that they're not too different from other modes of transportation in terms of injuries, and we had 0 fatalities through the pilot. So that's very hopeful. And I think they certainly have potential to expand access for underserved communities. We saw a lot of ridership in East Portland, and I think we can ask the companies to do more on that. And then with reducing air pollution, this is one thing that we just didn't have data on. So that's something that we're going to be looking for going forward to really understand and assess the climate pollution impacts. Primarily through charging, deployment, and operations of the companies. Of course, the e-scooters themselves are electric. They don't emit anything, but we're really curious about kind of those operational impacts. So I just wanted to highlight, since this group is, I'm sure interested in kind of diving in even more, that we have route data available online. And I apologize, I think the link is there, but maybe the color got change. So we do have route data online that you can download right now. So again, it's those kind of points of where people traveled through. We're going to have the endpoint data coming soon, so that A to B trip, where were those points at? And so keep your eyes out for that. I'll make sure that Trek folks know about when those become available. And we're going to be starting a new pilot this year, so that provides even more opportunity for getting involved. So our next steps, we put out our report last month, and starting next week, we're going to be looking at drafting new administrative rules and permit requirements. So again, we want to, really understand and dig into some of those things that we didn't understand well enough in that first pilot, including climate pollution and how we can expand opportunities for underserved access. And we want to make sure that we can, or see ways that we can maximize the benefits that we saw through modal trip replacement and things like that. So March, we're going to be asking companies to reapply for a permit, and in early spring, hope to have scooters on the ground. So this will be a one-year pilot that will be finishing up in 2020. And that's my contact.
All right, so I'm a professor here in Urban Studies and Planning, director of Trek. And I dug into the user survey data. So Brianna mentioned that the city conducted a survey. Being a researcher, I've done a lot of work on bicycling and why people bike or they don't bike, and I got very excited about what we might learn from e-scooter riders. And particularly what I'm focusing on today, and some of my motivation for this, is getting at one of the city's objectives of this pilot, which was expanding access for underserved communities. So when e-scooters, first came about, and I had a reporter call me about them one day, particularly about women, and could this get more women, because women don't bike very much and they aren't using bike share very much. So are e-scooters, could it be different? What about people of color? So it got me thinking, like, okay, what is the potential here? And with the survey data, we can learn a little bit. It's the start. There's not a whole lot of data out there about e-scooters. So here we go. So just quickly, the survey, City of Portland, Bureau of Transportation conducted the survey. They emailed it out to about 75,000 e-scooter customers who had provided their email address to one or more of the three companies that have the e-scooters in Portland. They received over 4,500 responses. I took out, for my analysis, there were several people in that survey, not a high proportion, but 80 people who indicated they actually had not ridden a scooter yet. They had signed up for some reason and they hadn't ridden it yet. So I took those out, but small number for now. That's the basics. Now, I should say this is obviously a huge sample size, over 4,000 e-scooter users. We don't know if that's representative of the e-scooter rider population, because we don't know what that is. But it's a pretty big sample, so at least of those users, we can see what they're thinking and how they feel about these things. And obviously, we don't know, Portland users may be different from other cities. But with those caveats, let's see what we did learn. So first of all, of the survey respondents, there was a question on the survey that asked, do you live or work in Portland? Okay, and so people who said yes to that question, for purposes of this presentation, I'm calling them residents. A few of them worked in Portland, but maybe didn't live in Portland. And Portland, whether it was City of Portland or Portland region, was not clear, but the vast majority of those residents actually gave a home zip code of living in the City of Portland. And then about 25% or so were visitors to Portland. My analysis for today here is going to focus on those residents, okay? Because when we talk about increasing access and opportunities for underserved communities, I want to focus on the Portland community. So what are some of the demographics of those riders? First of all, in terms of age, as we might have all guessed, e-scooter users tend to be younger than the population in general. 55% of them are 35 years or younger. Okay, so it's a young demographic, not surprising, similar to bike share and some other new mobility options. But it does raise questions of, is this a good option for older adults, and what might we do to encourage their use? Also, so the numbers I'm having in the charts there, the top are the e-scooter respondents from Portland. The bottom is American Community Survey data, so demographic data for the city of Portland. And then I will often have a note at the bottom here about if visitors differed. And in this case, visitors were a little bit younger than the residents who used e-scooters. There is a gender gap in e-scooter use. So despite what I speculated when I talked to that Wired reporter last summer, I thought, you know, maybe it would attract more women. But so far, at least in Portland, it doesn't seem to be. So only about a third of the users identified as female, which is obviously not representative of the population. The visitor split 40% female, so a little different there. And I dug into a lot of the gender numbers even more than I'm not going to be able to present today. I'm going to be posting something online about that later. In terms of race and ethnicity, though, we actually see a pretty good matchup between the e-scooter respondents to the survey in Portland versus the census data. This is a very simple dichotomy. People who indicated white for their race or ethnicities as the only race or ethnicity that they indicated versus people who indicated at least one or more options other than white. But you can see this does match the population fairly closely. The visitors were a little more diverse. 26% of the visitors were people of color. And then in terms of income, we actually also see a decent match. The categories on the survey were slightly different than the categories in the census. So they don't match up perfectly, but fairly well. And you can see that actually it's somewhat similar. So in other words, a little over 40% of the users had an income of under $50,000, and that's about the same as the City of Portland residents. So unlike one of the big criticisms of bike sharing and other sort of car sharing as well is that it's really attracted young, white, educated, higher income people for the most part. So we might be seeing something different with the e-scooters, especially with respect to income and perhaps a race and ethnicity as well. And then in terms of education, though, we are seeing definitely more higher educated people are using the e-scooters compared to the population as a whole. And then where the survey did ask for home zip codes, and nearly 3,000 respondents did provide their home zip code. So you can see here where the Portland respondents live. Clearly a concentration in the inner area. Those are also the more dense areas of the city in terms of population. Also corresponds fairly well with the map Brianna showed in terms of where people are riding. So this isn't a big surprise, but you do see in that East Portland area, that's in the pink zone, which is 54 to 86 riders living in those zip codes. Okay, so in terms of demographics, my quick conclusions of these users. They're younger and they're more educated than the population and more likely to be male, but they're generally matching fairly closely in terms of race, ethnicity, and income, at least using a fairly simple categories for those two items. So any differences in how people use the scooters? I did a lot of data analysis. I'm only providing a little bit of it here. The things that I think are perhaps more interesting. So women aren't joining as much and they're not using the scooters quite as often. So the women were more likely to say that they've only used it once and they aren't using it quite as frequently as men. There were no differences with respect to race or ethnicity with respect to how frequently people were using the e-scooters. The oldest adults, 55 or over, were the ones who were most likely of the age groups to say that they tried it once and haven't done it since. And income, there was no clear pattern in terms of frequency of use. In terms of where people are writing them to, here you have the trip purpose of all respondents. There were a few differences. Women were less likely to use them to go to work or transit, more likely to use them for social recreation or fun and recreation. People of color were less likely to use them going to restaurants or shopping, more likely fun. There seems to be a lot of people who like try it out for fun. And I have to say, when I tried one out myself, it is fun. And I overhear other people trying them out for the first time, and it's often people talk about how fun it is. And so that seems to be attracting a lot of people. The question will be, once they have that first, perhaps, hopefully fun, safe ride, then will they continue to use them and for what purposes? And as you might expect, lower income, less likely to use them for work. Lower income people are perhaps less likely to be making a lot of work trips. So some of those are not surprising differences. There was a question on the survey, would you recommend e-scooters to a friend? So this is sort of a level of support and of e-scooters. And across the board, with the exception of age, people were equally likely. 85% said they were very or extremely likely to recommend e-scooters to a friend. That's a very high level of support. And again, no demographic differences except for people 45 and older were a little less likely, but it statistically significant, but not a huge number. And then there's another question about, in the future, if these continue, do you think you'll be using them, and how frequently might you use them in the future? And the options were I combined them to be less than once a week, 1 to 3 times a week, or more than 3 times a week. And you can see on the left the distribution for the whole sample of Portland residents. And then what I've said there is whether or not there were some demographic differences. So women were less likely to state that they would use them frequently in the future. So sort of that same pattern of not using them as frequently as men might continue into the future. People of color, though, were more likely to say that in the future they'll ride more frequently than the white respondents. Older, less likely. Lower income, more likely to ride frequently. So again, we're seeing a little bit of indication that perhaps people of color and lower income users are using them and interested perhaps in using them more. And then education, less or more likely to ride frequently in the future compared to people with higher education. And then there was another question on the survey that I found interesting once I started looking at the demographics. It was, what changes would encourage you to use e-scooters more? These were options provided by the City of Portland. And I've sorted them by the overall percent of respondents saying, so 2/3 said just have more of them available. And what I need to dig into is if people, for example, living in East Portland were more likely to say that. I will try to answer that soon. And then what I have there, the more or less, is whether or not that demographic group was more or less likely to say that, yes, this would get me to ride e-scooters more than the other group. And a couple things to point out here. On the gender side, you can see that women said safer places to ride would make them more likely, and that was significantly higher than the share of men who said that that was important to them. So we're seeing some similar things for women and e-scooters as we see with women and bicycling in terms of wanting safe places to ride and separated infrastructure. Some of the other things, if you look at, for example, lower income and people of color, they're interested in having more e-scooters available, longer battery life, lower cost, having them in surrounding cities outside of Portland. So sort of more access to these were of particular interest. And I think, so my conclusion so far, again, digging into the data, it's early stages of this analysis. There's definitely a gender gap in use, similar to what we see in bike share and bicycling. Infrastructure, I think, might be part of the solution. I didn't present the numbers here, but there's definitely an interest amongst women of using e-scooters in more protected environments away from motor vehicle traffic. The users match the population more closely in terms of race and ethnicity and income than what we see for bike share. And I say that generically in terms of the research throughout the country and in lots of different cities is showing that bike share is not reaching that diverse lower income population. And then also that note that the lower income and people of color seem perhaps maybe a little more enthusiastic about them in the future in terms of frequency of use. But I don't want us to forget about some of those barriers to use that Brianna referred to already that came out of the focus groups and some of the other work that they did. And this is similar to bike sharing. Credit cards, needing a credit card for the most part to use these systems. The cost of using them, those concerns about profiling, the availability, you know, are they available where I live, for example, in East Portland and elsewhere. The education difference, the e-scooter users have higher education. That just raises questions for me about, are there other barriers to use these new options? It may also reflect some age distribution, but anyway, don't know about that. But I put that up here because future research. So now it is time for questions for all of us. So want Brianna to come back up. And good, we are right on time for questions.
I was talking into the microphone. I think we'll start up here at the front.
So some of the national reporting I've heard is a little bit more pessimistic on the injury front than what your experience was. Are you looking at any national data sets to get a better picture on injuries?
Come out that actually are pretty similar to the ones that Multnomah County Health Department did. So we're looking at that, and while the numbers are similar, I think the conclusions are different. So I think you know, how you interpret the data is really important, and what you compare it to. So I think, you know, one of the things that kind of guides our understanding of those numbers of injuries is the severity of them, as well as understanding the severity of, you know, car injuries and vehicle injuries. So during this pilot period, we had 14 deaths happen in Portland from pedestrian and car injury, car collisions. And so, you know, we had 0 deaths during this pilot period, and that's one of the things that we're taking into account.
Along the same lines, I had a question about where these injuries are occurring. Are they in locations where there's lack of separated infrastructure, or like how are they spread out?
That's a really good question that I wish we knew the answer. So Multnomah County, the way that they get their data, it's through the hospital records. And so while we may know what ER or urgent care they went to, we don't know where those collisions happened.
Hi, I'm just curious how weather-related impact with the e-scooter. Like, for example, you guys started in July, and that was the summer months and was mostly sunny. Daylight was out longer, and then as it progressed to the end of fall, it became darker quicker and more rainy days probably by November. I'm just wondering, do you guys have an analysis on the differences in safety or use between the warmer season? Because this next one's going to be a year-long, you said, right? Just curious how the weather impacted everything.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would point you to our appendix, which has both has the Multnomah County safety data. So we saw actually a decline in the number of injuries throughout the pilot period. So that would suggest that there's maybe not a relationship between daylight hours or weather. But again, you'd have to dig into that. In regards to your trip question, we do have trips reported per day in the findings report. So if you look into there, you see a decline certainly as the weather declines, and that's very similar to what we see with bike share.
Brianna, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I might be mistaken, but I think it's around slide 11 in your presentation. It said e-scooters, active transportation. And I'm curious because I always thought active transportation required a physical activity that resulted in a health benefit. So how can you consider scooters being active transportation?
Yeah, what gives? We also call transit active transportation.
Well, that's different because it requires somebody to walk to a transit stop.
And when we asked people how they got to that e-scooter that they rode, they walked.
Well, out of their building to the sidewalk.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure how far they walked. We didn't ask.
Would be the same thing.
Oh, except that they're scattered all over the city. They're not parked in front of you. I mean, I walked sometimes 3 miles and then took a scooter for the last mile to work.
I can walk out of this
that's one
building,
data point,
get
but
on a
people
bus.
often use these as part of a trip rather than as a whole trip because they have to find trips. But they're not always outside your doorstep. They're really not.
I think it is an interesting question. I mean, this comes up with electric bikes as well. And there's pretty good research that shows with an electric assist bike, you're still getting some physical energy. And I had this exact same question when I rode it for the first time. And I was trying to think, does it require sort of some core balance or you know, maybe it's a different type of activity? I've had the same question. I think it's a good one. I think we could debate both sides.
So we have an online question as well from Ray. Do you recommend each city and county in the Portland region create their own policies and regulations, or would it make sense to have Metro create regional policies?
That's a great question. I think, you know, certainly we have been working through Metro to create some data sharing standards. And I think that part is really important so we can understand and compare apples to apples, you know, looking at trips and how do we define a trip, looking at, you know, deployment and looking at other metrics. So I think those things are really important. And I think it's also really important for us to kind of set at least some baseline standards of how we approach, you know, what we're asking companies to follow in terms of our regulations. So, you know, one example that we've talked with Metro on is that impacts all cities in the region is kind of the TriMet policy, you know, and should we create dedicated parking around TriMet areas and things like that. So I think there's a lot of synergies that could happen that make a lot of sense if we have some regional policies. And we have to know that, you know, some cities have different interests than Portland might. So allowing for some flexibility for other cities to make sure that this aligns with their city goals. Yeah. How?
Okay, so I have a question. So the fun factor is strong, especially among teenagers, being a mom of 2 teenage boys, and yet the minimum age to ride an e-scooter is 18. But the minimum age to ride a bike share bike is 16. So is the city considering lowering the minimum age? Because I'm sure there are parents out there who have allowed their kids to ride the scooters because it is an alternative to driving their kids to school, as well as an alternative for their kids to get from point A to point B for short distances.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the state set age limits for e-scooter users. It's 16 at the state level, and all of these companies set their own age requirement of 18. So they're a little bit higher actually than what the state standard is. Bike share is actually, it's an 18 age requirement. And we would love to bring that down to 16 and allow, you know, folks that are getting to high school access to bike share. Part of this is just that it's when you're agreeing to use that equipment, it's a contract and it's a user agreement, and you know, part of it is being 18. But I think that there's a lot of space for how do we allow for parent consent in those situations, and yeah, I mean, if we allow you know, folks to be driving, certainly at 16, then why are we not allowing them to ride this kind of vehicle?
I'm curious, it might be too early in the process, but how do you think these findings will shape the next pilot? Will it mostly be minor tweaks or maybe some more substantial changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that some of the biggest challenges that we had are certainly going to be things that we look to address in the second pilot. Hearing from folks around sidewalk accessibility and just that pedestrian comfort, I think is a big thing that we want to take on and work with companies who are willing to help us take that on. So whether that's helping us get through to users, through warnings or through fines, or potentially not allowing somebody to be on the platform if they continue to ride on the sidewalk. Those are things that we want to look at, as well as there's lots of technology coming out. I was just at a micromobility conference in California where folks are talking about beacons that could be installed in places throughout the city to kind of monitor sidewalk riding, or will scooters of the future have the ability to detect if they're on the sidewalk or not. So those are some of the things that we're looking at, as well as, we required that scooters are parked in the furnishing zone in the first pilot. And I think knowing some of the conflicts that arose through people with disabilities and I think with users not understanding where the furnishing zone is, right? It's not really a common terminology. We want to make sure that we kind of, encourage folks to utilize existing infrastructure and potentially look to create additional dedicated parking areas.
So I'll admit, out of the many times that I rode a scooter throughout the 4 months, I think I wore a helmet one time just to see what it was like. I just want to poll the room real quick. How many people rode a scooter without a helmet at least once? Mm-hmm. I think your data supports that. I think that said something like 45% of people admitted to never wearing a helmet. Mm-hmm. I know the vast majority of people at least once didn't wear a helmet. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of reasons why that's the case. Mm-hmm. Same issues that you have with bike share. There's a discrepancy, as we were talking about, the discrepancy between state law and the ages for bike share and scooters. There's a discrepancy with state law between bikes and scooters regarding helmet use. Currently, everyone is required to wear a helmet. Even though the fine is only $25, and I doubt there were any citations for it, it's still definitely a barrier to entry that a lot of people identified. Unfortunately, I don't think it was touched upon in the survey. Mm-hmm. I didn't notice any questions specifically.
There was a question, did you wear a helmet, or how often did you wear a helmet?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to remember the majority of people said no, I never wear it, or a lot of them said no, I never or seldom. Mm-hmm. There were no gender differences in terms of helmet use, which I'll be honest surprised me a little bit, but there were no gender differences, and I don't remember offhand, there weren't very, actually, I do know, there may have been some other differences. Younger people were less likely to use a helmet than older people, for example. Mm-hmm. Things that you would expect.
And so I guess what I'm wondering, California recently passed Assembly Bill 2989 and was signed into law and went into effect last month. Mm-hmm. But now, basically, it's similar. I think under 18 still required to wear a helmet, but for all adults, they're fine without. And I know that under Oregon legislature, there's currently House Bill 2671 that's in the process to bring the age limit in line with the bike limit of 16 or under 16. And so I guess I'm wondering if that's something that is supported by the pilot and what the city is doing to encourage looking at the effects of that and promoting that without, necessarily requiring helmets.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I can address it right now, but maybe we can talk after. I think that our pilot showed that, the number of injuries and the kinds of injuries that happened were not, majority of them were not severe. And we also know that a majority of those injuries happen just by falling off the e-scooter. So we know that helmets are really designed for that kind of solo fall, and that's when they really do protect some of that impact. And we also did hear from folks that if they're concerned about being racially profiled, being stopped, that some of these laws that are pretty blatantly not followed could result in some inequity in terms of enforcement. So that's what I would say right now, and we're certainly watching to see what happens with that bill.
I just want to mention I got, I think Lime sent out 3 helmets. I know. I didn't get mine until November 30th.
Mm.
I thought that was kind of fun.
It's not very helpful, is it?
Hi, I've got a question for Professor Dill. In bicycle planning, we often sort of hang our hats on the concept of the 4 types of cyclists. And I'm curious if you have thought at all a bit about that breakdown for scooter use, and mainly, again, as we talk about the 4 types of cyclists, we often refer to as the interested but concerned in the swing category of getting people to use bicycles. I'm curious, just if you think that concept breakdown is applicable to scooter use, and if there's any findings on the percentage breakdown of that in Portland.
Really good question that I'm a little embarrassed I hadn't thought of myself since I've done research on the 4 types of cyclists. One, since this is just user data, I can't really try to use it to come up with that same typology, because the 4 types of cyclists actually includes people who don't bicycle and people who bicycle. I think some of the concepts there might still apply. That idea that there are some people who are not using it or not using it very often because they're concerned about traffic safety. Okay, there's definitely some of that going on in these data. But I wouldn't, I will do more research on that and see. I can't do the exact analysis using this survey, but I have a feeling there might be some other types in there. Yeah.
So Jennifer highlighted that people of color and lower income have a interest in wanting to use the scooters more. But at the same time, and the city did a great job of, trying to test and push scooters out to that area. But the companies didn't necessarily meet that, distribution of, throughout the program. So it seems like there's a group that wants it, but did you find out why they were not able to meet or put the scooters out there? And then in general, I highlighted that Austin had 15,000 scooter permits that are, is there a scaling thing that we need to think about to really get to an issue of accessibility for anybody within the Portland region?
Yeah, those great questions. Yeah, I think as to companies being why they couldn't meet that requirement, I think I'd have to talk to them to understand what those reasons were. But I think I can take a guess at they weren't making as much money out in East Portland as they are downtown. We know that utilization in East Portland, so how many trips did a particular scooter get per day? We know that was lower in East Portland, and that's how companies are making their money based on those numbers of trips ridden. So I think that could be one reason. I think that part of it could be that we could define a little bit better through our data specifications what we mean when we say make this available in East Portland. We could think through other metrics that we might want to think about. Is it just it's available the first time in the day, or is it available throughout the day, or things like that. And I think that goes back to your question around what's the right scale for Portland. And I think every city is trying to address that, and in part it's understanding what's the right number of trips per day, on the company side that they're really aiming for, as well as what does it mean to have scooters that are only used once a day in an area? Does that create parking issues? And if it's not available, what does that mean for demand and reliability, and folks just not feeling like they can actually rely on this service? So it's a tough question, and we're actively talking about it right now as we get ready for the second pilot. So I don't have a specific answer, but in terms of what we saw and heard through both the user survey and the citywide poll, was that folks wanted at least 2,500 scooters, which is what we had originally conceptualized at the beginning of the pilot, or more. So that's kind of a barometer for us.
I have a question. I'm curious why pay for the why pay for the cost per minute rather than pay the cost per distance? Because, for example, the user who ride first time, they unfamiliar to operate the e-scooter, so they have to pay more than others. So I think the distance is more reasonable price.
Does incentivize going fast.
Yes, it does. Yeah, much like car share and other types of transportation, paying per minute certainly incentivizes going there as quickly as you can. And I don't know, companies set these models up, and it was a pretty stark shift from what we saw with bike share overall. Bike share being, you pay in maybe per day or per month. For Bike Town, you have an annual pass that you can pay into. Or if you're a PSU student, it's free. So I'm not sure why the companies chose that model. Again, I think it probably goes back to being able to make a profit.
I would also maybe speculate some of it has to do with the technology. It's a lot easier to measure how much time than to measure they all have GPS on them, but there's a lot of error, particularly when you're in a downtown environment. The GPS point may say that it's someplace else, and then it may not be an accurate representation of exactly the distance, whereas time I think could be accurate.
Yeah.
But I'm just speculating for the companies. Where is the
microphone's right over
here? Yeah, two quick ones. First, on a question that was already asked, but a little more detail, right? There have been a lot of news reports very recently out of San Francisco and other cities of substantial head injuries and trauma and emergency room visits. A much different picture than what's presented here. So I'm wondering, how did we escape that? And the other is just, what is the current thinking on getting some money back from these companies to tithe into our infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we can only speculate, but certainly the investments that the city's already made in safe infrastructure, I think, is probably part of it. So having bike lanes, having neighborhood greenways, and things like that. We know, actually, I'll shout out Corrine Montana, who's here, who did a lot of observations in the right of way, understanding where people are riding. And so we saw if on a neighborhood greenway, for example, where there's slow traffic, fewer cars overall, people feel comfortable riding in the street and not on the sidewalk. On the sidewalk, there's a lot of bumps and tree roots and things like that can happen. And I think the street's a little bit more reliable in that sense. So that could be part of it. But I think overall, it's just too early to tell kind of the long-term safety and injury analysis of this new type of vehicle. We still are waiting to get data from Oregon Department of Transportation to understand fatalities that happened and injuries that happened overall on our roadway. So these things just take a little bit of time. Remind me what the second part of your question was. The money. Where's the money?
How do we get money back from these companies that are using our infrastructure?
Yes.
Using our streets?
Yes.
Giving us funding and everything.
Right, absolutely. So we did charge companies both permit fees and a per ride surcharge. So that money went into both the administration and kind of monitoring of the program, as well as evaluating the program. And we're actively in conversations about what is the right price, what should it support. But I do think that, it should go back into supporting better infrastructure, certainly for people using e-scooters and for people who are also trying to walk around the city.
Great. So we're just over the hour mark. So we'll take one more question, and then we'll end the broadcast for our online webinar viewers. And then if you did submit questions online, we'll follow up via email to any unanswered questions there. And then for those of you who are in the room, we invite you to continue asking questions and engaging in conversation after the last question.
So I think you mentioned that Lime and Bird both have pretty significant discounts, offer significant discounts for low-income people. I think it's 50% off, and they both do a pretty horrible job of publicizing that. Does the city have any intention of getting actively involved in in basically educating people and raising awareness of the availability of those programs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, it gets too kind of broader. What are our roles here? It's a private company doing business in the right of way, and what's the role of the city in regulating, enabling, or rewarding that activity? So in terms of trying to provide more equitable service, especially for underserved communities, I think we have an interest in making sure those low-income plans are utilized and known about. So yeah, I think we will take a more active stance in doing that. But I think also we're going to be looking to the companies to make sure that they are doing what we're asking of them. And in this first pilot, all we required was that they had a low income plan. We didn't specify what the amount needed to be or how many users they needed to sign up. So it's possible we get more prescriptive with that requirement, or it's possible that we incentivize companies that are doing a good job there. So, again, working on what that 2.0 looks like right now and having those conversations about, should we incentivize or should we regulate, and what's the right approach.
Great. So a big thank you to our presenters and to the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And one final comment, if you didn't have a chance to sign in, we would really appreciate you signing in just for our documentation. And then if you're interested, we have a full lineup for our Friday transportation seminar available up here at the front and online at our website. Thank you.